So hello everyone, a warm welcome to this revision video about the experience of German people under the Nazis. This revision video is going to focus on Nazi social policy and how that was put into practice in Germany in the 1930s and into the 1940s. We're going to look at the reasons for the Nazi policies. We're going to think about the impact of Nazi policies on women, young people, including youth groups, and education. We're going to talk about how the Nazis gained control of the churches and religion during the 1930s, 1940s, and then we're going to find out about the Nazis' ideas in terms of the Aryan race and their racial policy and the persecution of the Jewish people and other groups within Germany, and we're also going to focus on the final solution as well. So, without further ado, let's find out more about this topic of social policy and practice in Germany in the 1930s. Okay, so we'll start this revision video off by thinking about the reasons for Nazi racial policy and persecution of groups. So we know that Hitler outlined his racial policies in his book Mein Kampf, which he wrote whilst he was in prison at Landsberg Fortress, and we can see here that it's worth remembering that the Nazis targeted many different groups within Nazi Germany, as well as, of course, the Jewish people. So the Nazis persecuted those deemed as work shy, so people that were seen as being criminals or tramps, beggars, those that were deemed as, quote, work shy, that were reluctant to work, they were rounded up, and around about 500,000 people ended up in concentration camps as a result of that. The first concentration camps opened, of course, in 1933. Hitler banned all of the political parties in 1933, so many socialists and communists ended up in concentration camps. The Nazis targeted disabled people, so physically disabled people, and people that were regarded as being mentally ill. They were seen by the Nazis as a burden on society. 350,000 men, women and children were with inherited conditions were forcibly sterilized. In 1939, 5,200 mentally and physically disabled children were murdered by the Nazis. They also had a euthanasia program which killed 71,000 people by 1931. Now, there were some protests against the euthanasia program led by the Catholic Bishop von Galen, and the sermon that he wrote, which condemned it, was read by many Germans, and this actually led to the Nazis halting the euthanasia program, so it's a good example of opposition. Hitler believed that Aryans were the true Germans, so Aryans were not allowed to marry or have children with other races, including black people and Jewish people. Gypsies were persecuted, around 500,000 being murdered by the Nazis. We know that Hitler blamed Jewish people for Germany's problems. Hitler was also against gay people, so gay men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, and many were used in medical experiments. So, you know, looking at the scale of that, absolutely horrific in terms of what happened and the Nazi persecution of different groups within Germany. So in terms of the Nazi policies towards the Jewish people, again, it's really important for you to understand the chronology of what happened. So in terms of Jewish people in Germany in 1933, at the start of 1933, Jewish people made up around 1% of the German population. German Jewish people made up around about 70% of bankers, 10% of doctors, and 16% of lawyers. Now, Hitler was anti-Semitic, which means he's against Jewish people, and he wrote about his racial views in Mein Kampf. And Hitler and the Nazis blamed Jewish people for Germany's problems, blamed them for the defeat in the First World War, talked a lot about things like the stab in the back myth and November criminals, which were linked to Jewish people by the Nazis. Now, life, of course, very sadly changed for Jewish people when the Nazis came to power, and it's important you have some examples of this. So there's a boycott of Jewish shops organised by the SA, who attached posters to Jewish businesses and shops, encouraging people to boycott them. Jewish people were banned from government jobs, such as civil servants, teachers, lawyers, journalists and media jobs, and Jewish and non-Jewish children were no longer allowed to play together. Now, one of the things that Nazis did when they came to power is they indoctrinated people against Jewish people. So in schools, for example, children learnt new subjects such as race studies and eugenics, which taught young people to be anti-Semitic. Stories were told, such as the poisonous mushroom story, which portrayed Jewish people to be dangerous. And as you can see in that picture there, children's books and school textbooks were rewritten with anti-Semitic propaganda. Now, in terms of the anti-Semitic propaganda, signs began to appear in public places saying things like Jews not wanted represented here. Films such as The Eternal Jew portrayed Jews as dangerous. Speeches from Nazis such as at the Nuremberg rallies portrayed Jews as being responsible for all of Germany's problems. Jews began to be banned from public places such as parks, while special benches for Jewish people, which were painted yellow, appeared in public places as well. Now, the Nuremberg Laws were passed in 1935. Now, this is one of the key events that you need to be aware of and is a turning point in how Jewish people are treated. So the Nuremberg Laws contain a couple of laws. The first is the Reich Law on citizenship, which says that only those of German blood can be a German citizen. Jews were seen as being subjects, not citizens, and had to wear a yellow star-shaped patch on their clothes. The Reich Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honour said that Jews were forbidden from marrying German citizens, and it banned sexual relations between Jews and what were seen as being German citizens. The Berlin Olympics of 1936 is quite an interesting one to think about. So Hitler hoped that the Berlin Olympics would show off the Aryan race. The Olympics were held in Berlin between the 1st and 16th of August 1936, and it led to the so-called Olympic pause, where Jewish persecution was removed from public view and lots of anti-Semitic propaganda was taken down. However, it's important to note that the persecution of Jewish people continued outside of Berlin, and the routes where the visitors from abroad did not get to travel. It wasn't a long-lasting change, and once the Olympics were over, the anti-Semitic propaganda and the bad treatment of the Jewish people continued. Now, 1938 was a key turning point, with more anti-Semitic laws and laws against Jewish people increasing. So Jews were banned from in 1938, or by 1938, they were banned from owning radios, typewriters or bikes. They were not allowed to go to the cinema, theatre or concert halls. They wouldn't be able to buy newspapers and magazines, attend school or university, or indeed have their own businesses. And Jewish people had to add Israel or Sarah to their names to identify them as Jewish. Now, one of the big events that you need to know about in terms of the treatment of Jewish people, and this is a turning point, is the events of the Night of the Broken Glass, Kristallnacht, which was the 8th to the 9th of November 1938. And this is a key event in changing the lives of Jewish people. It's actually triggered by the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a Jewish student. Now, in retaliation, Joseph Goebbels, who is head of propaganda in Germany, but also quite a figure that was very much responsible for lots of the anti-Semitic policies and campaigns in Germany. He organised a campaign of violence, which is essentially a pogrom. He encouraged Nazis and the SS to attack Jewish people, their property and synagogues. Now, on the Night of the Broken Glass, around about 91 Jewish people were killed. Streets in Germany were full of smashed glass, hence the name, and lots and lots of damage was done. Lots of synagogues, for example, were set fire to. Firefighters were given the instructions not to put the fires out unless that they would damage nearby buildings. There was actually quite a lot of unease about what happened over Kristallnacht, and therefore Goering actually blamed the events on the Jewish people, and he actually fined the Jewish people 1 billion German marks to pay for the damage that the Nazis had caused. Obviously, this was a turning point. In the months after, 30,000 German Jewish people were arrested and were sent to concentration camps. As we said, many German people were absolutely shocked by the violence, but there were very little organised protests, and therefore it had an effect of leading to an escalation in anti-Semitism and led to many German Jewish people leaving the country. Okay, now the next turning point in how the lives of Jewish people changed in Nazi Germany was the invasion of Poland. So when Germany conquered Poland in 1939, this meant that 3.5 million more Jewish people came under Nazi control. In Warsaw, Jewish people were forced into a small walled area, which was known as the Warsaw Ghetto, where the people had to survive on just 300 calories a day. And this was one of the things that happened during the Second World War, is that every time the Nazis took over more territory, the Jewish people that lived inside those territories were subject to the same racism, discrimination and persecution that they'd experienced. And of course, there's some Jewish people that would have left Germany in the 1930s to live in these countries, who then found themselves once again under Nazi control. Now, in June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and the German army was followed by SS units called the Einsatzgruppen, who rounded up Jewish people and killed them. and they were buried in mass graves. And from this led to what was called the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. Basically, what happened in July 1941, Goering ordered the final solution to the Jewish question in Europe, which meant, sadly, the genocide of Jewish people of Europe. And basically what happened is the Nazis met at Wannsee, and they agreed to plan this so-called final solution, which was basically the plan to kill all the Jewish people within Europe, a genocide. So the final solution was resulted in tragically 6 million Jewish people being murdered. Jewish people have been taken from their homes to the death camps, Auschwitz, Sobibor, Belzec, Treblinka, Majdanek and Chelmno. On arrival, the Jewish people would walk past a Nazi doctor who would indicate whether they should go left, which meant they would have to work, or go right and be sent direct to the gas chambers. Approximately 80% of people were killed straight away. Jewish prisoners would work in the camps, or they would be hired out for slave labour, and the conditions were absolutely horrendous. Hardly any food. The working conditions were awful. There was the camps had lots of diseases, and it meant that at least 500,000 Jewish people also died from working as slave labour. And it's really important to remember the Jewish resistance that took place during the Second World War. There was lots of Jewish people that resisted and took to the countryside. There were armed uprisings that took place in the ghettos. There was sabotage attempts and fighting by Jewish people against German forces. During 1943, 15,000 Jewish people held out for 4 weeks against German forces. In October 1943, 600 prisoners escaped from Sobibor camp in Poland. And of course, learning about the events of the Holocaust and what happened to the Jewish people in Nazi Germany is obviously a really, really important thing to learn about. And obviously it's important that we never forget what happened with the Holocaust. And of course we remember each year that we remember Holocaust Memorial Day on the 27th of January each year. So it's a really, really important topic to think about and remember.